called him Jonathan. Jonathan heard the situation, then he offered, well, if I need to, I could sell some of my toys and give the money to buy a new camera. You know, we smile and think of Jonathan's naivete. But I think we can all admire his willingness to give up things that were really important to him, that he enjoyed a lot because he felt that there was a need. Today I urge all of us to be willing to make similar sacrifices in our lives if God asks us to. I'll be teaching out of the book of Hebrews in chapter 3 and verse 15, where it says, "Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts." Now, a few years ago, I was swimming in a creek and I found a lump of clay. And I thought, oh wow, this is cool, I should take it home. And so I took it home and set it somewhere, and then I went off and forgot about it. And by the time I remembered, that clay had hardened into an ugly clump that was essentially useless. Unfortunately, the same thing can happen to our hearts when they're left alone, when we're not actively seeking the living water of the Holy Spirit. And that's why today we need to make sure that we are having our hearts open to follow God no matter what He calls us to do, no matter what He calls us to give up. I'd like to explore this topic by looking first of all at how our hearts can become like a stone, and then secondly, why we need to look at the specifics, and finally, how we can let God do the softening. So first of all, we need to look at how our hearts can become like a stone. If you've ever been in a conversation and you were talking to someone and clearly winning the argument, and they just decided to say, "This conversation's over, I'm not listening anymore," doubtless you were extremely frustrated. I mean, you have valuable wisdom to impart and they're missing out on so much. But sometimes we can do the same thing to God. His quiet, gentle nudges are met with a cold, brittle heart that is hardened into an ugly lump of clay, as hard as a rock. Zechariah chapter 7 verses 11 through 13 say, "But they refused to listen and stopped their ears that they should not hear. Yea, they made their hearts as an adamant stone. Therefore, as he cried, and they would not hear, so they cried, and I would not hear." You see, sometimes when we're looking and we're reading the Bible, we're not doing it to try to learn something about what God wants to teach us. Instead, we're just simply seeking affirmation of what we already believe. When God or a pastor or someone in a speech talks about something, we immediately jump into the defense of what we're already doing, without even waiting to consider whether or not God is trying to teach us something. I believe that we should have an open heart. Now, I will clarify that that's a little different than having an open mind. I'm not saying we should have a totally open mind, because minds that are totally open tend to have a lot of trash fall in them. What I'm saying is that we should have an open heart to whatever God is asking us to do. Not me or some other person, but what God is saying. Philip Telfer, in his book on media choices, writes that, quote, "What is it that you would not give up if God clearly asked you to? Whatever it is most likely a spiritual bane in your life. It might be the very thing that stops you in the tracks of Christ, unwilling to follow any further." You see, we need to have a heart that's willing and open to change whatever God says. We need to have a heart that's willing to have God renovate it, even if there's a part that we enjoy. Now see, this all sounds great when we're here and we're sitting listening to a sermon, but it's a little harder when we're getting home and we're home alone deciding what to do with our time. That's what we need to look at secondly, that we need to look at the specifics, because that's really where we need to get down to the nitty-gritty and apply this to our lives. I think that most of us are holding back more than we care to admit. Perhaps it's a sin that we enjoy too much to give up just yet. Or maybe it's not a sin, it's just something that God is specifically calling us to give up. I'll start with myself. A few years ago, I started reading a book about some survival people who, they're doomsday preppers, and they try to survive after an EMP wipes out the power grid. And I became engrossed in the series and finished the first 2 books. But I noticed that there were some cuss words and some other objectionable lines. But I figured, it's not too bad, I'll just keep on reading. But eventually, God began to work in my life to show me that maybe it wasn't a sin for me to read it. But it wasn't helping my spiritual growth. It wasn't something that needed to be part of my life. And so, I never finished the series, and I never figured out what happened to those poor doomsday preppers. You see, we need to be willing to give up anything, even our liberty, if God asks us to. And so I'm asking you today, is there anything in your life that you would be unwilling to change if God asked you to? if nothing comes to mind, allow me to offer some possibilities that I've noticed across the population as a whole, and perhaps one of them might be applicable to you. The first is that of missions. If God were to call you to uproot your entire life right now and move to a different culture, a different language, with a different diet, and a different internet speed, would you be willing to go? Secondly, how about mercy? When we look at a homosexual or a drunkard or a homeless person, we tend to turn up our nose. But when Jesus looks at that person, he sees someone that he loves so much that he died to save them. I think sometimes we need to reconsider the way we look at people. Or how about our mouth? We need to remember that anything that comes out of our mouth ultimately came from our heart. As Jesus said in Matthew 12:34, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so, when we look at that, we need to consider what Amy Carmichael said. Missionary Amy Carmichael said that a cup full of sweetness cannot spill even one drop of bitter water, no matter how suddenly jarred. Now, even though some of us may not curse or do things like that, some of us still perhaps gossip or tear others down with our words. So do we need to relook at our mouth? Or how about the issue of media? Should movies that glorify sin and rebellion against God have a place in our lives and our hearts? Are songs that glorify sin and rebelling against God worthy of filling our minds, never to be forgotten for years afterwards? Or how about the issue of modesty? It was completely illegitimate for Adam to blame Eve for his sin because she offered him the fruit, because everyone is responsible for their own actions. But should Eve have offered him the fruit? If you don't want people looking at certain parts of your body, then why would you upload pictures of them to social media? But I would like to say that guys are not exempt. In fact, guys can be even more immodest when it comes to having a modest spirit. Or how about the issue of magic? In Acts 19:19, the believers burned all their books about witchcraft. So do we have any place in our lives for books that talk about witchcraft or glorify it if the early believers burned it, if God clearly condemns it? Now, I'll stop there for the sake of time and because I ran out of words that begin with N. But I would like to say we do need to be careful, of course, that we don't fall into legalism. Following God is not about making rules for every area of our life. It's about letting God rule every area of our life. We need to be willing to let God change everything about our life and then follow through with that action. The change needs to start with the inside and move outward. That's the opposite of legalism. So we've seen how our hearts can become like a stone, and we've looked at some specific ways that can happen. But now let's look at how we can let God do the softening. See, perhaps you've been thinking, well, sure, but only God can soften someone's heart. And of course I agree. But as the Bible says in 1 Thessalonians 5:19, we should not quench the Spirit. You see, sometimes God's nudges are met just with a little bit of resistance, not enough of purposeful action. We're not actively seeking out the Holy Spirit. And that's what we need to be doing. You see, clay just has to be left alone to harden. And if our hearts are not actively seeking the living water of the Holy Spirit, they can slowly fade like a flower in a waterless vase. Our gears of change can become rusty and stiff. When we look at the story of perhaps Rehoboam in the Bible, his father was the wise king Solomon. And yet Rehoboam eventually turned away from God. Why? The Bible actually says in 2 Chronicles 12:14, he did evil because he prepared not his heart to seek the Lord. We need to prepare our hearts to actively seek out the Lord. The passage I've been preaching out of today is Hebrews 3:15, which says, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. Thankfully, this same passage also offers the vaccine against developing a hard heart. Verse 13 says, exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. See that first part there, exhort one another daily. We need to find friends who will keep us accountable and daily urge us to seek the Lord, to follow him, whatever he calls us to do. Because this accountability is truly what can keep our heart from becoming hard. For example, if your issue is modesty or an immodest spirit, Find a good, godly friend who can tell you if what you're wearing is appropriate or if the way you're acting is in line with what God calls us to act like. Or another example is my friend Logan. Logan went to church camp one summer and realized that he needed to stop cussing. And so he made a pact with a friend that if either one of them cussed, the other one would slap him in the face as hard as they could. They each messed up once. Never again. Perhaps we think that's a little extreme. But compared to what Jesus said about cutting off your hand or pulling out your eye, I don't think it's extreme at all. And yes, that really hurt. Today I've talked about how our hearts can become a stone, why we need to look at the specifics, and how we can let God do the softening. See, ultimately, we need to prepare our hearts to seek the Lord and follow Him no matter where He leads us, no matter what He calls us to change, no matter what we like. We need to be willing to give up anything, even our liberty, if God asks us to. We need to be willing to give up things we enjoy, like Jonathan was willing to give up his toys. It's not about making rules for every area of our life, but letting God rule every area of our life. Because when we do that, we can lay in our beds at night happy, knowing that we are doing exactly what God wanted us to do. As Jim Elliot said, God always gives His best to those who leave the choice with Him. Hymn writer Adelaide Pollard wrote, "Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still." If we let God be the potter of our lives, He alone will shape them into a beautiful thing, fit for use by a king. Amen.